we knew the exact tone that we wanted it to be. And Carl Reiner said to me, he said, you can establish the tone of the movie in the first 2 minutes, and you can tell the audience what the rules are and how far you're willing to go. And that's why the opening scene of The Jerk is ridiculous.
Comedy icon or not, Steve Martin had some heavy grudges hiding behind that polite smile and sharp wit. Behind the laughs, Martin carried deep irritation with a handful of co-stars who turned his time on set into pure stress. For years, he kept it quiet, never letting the cracks show, but the truth is finally spilling. And topping the list, Chevy Chase. When Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short teamed up in 1986's Three Amigos, audiences thought they were watching three comedy legends at their absolute peak, a hilarious trio stuck in a wild Western-style misadventure. On screen, the chemistry was golden, but off camera, it was anything but harmony. For Steve, the movie wasn't about friendship at all, and it was survival, especially when it came to handling Chevy. Martin showed up with discipline. Lines memorized, script in hand, determined to respect the material he had co-written with Randy Newman and Lorne Michaels. He believed comedy wasn't chaos. It was rhythm, timing, and sticking to the beats. Every joke, every pause had to serve the bigger picture. Chevy, though, had zero interest in that kind of order. With his superstar reputation from SNL, Caddyshack, and Fletch, he walked on set like rules were for everyone else. Hollywood already knew his reputation. Brilliant, sure, but arrogant, hard to manage, and constantly clashing with authority. On Three Amigos, he lived up to every rumor. He hijacked scenes by changing lines, tossing in unscripted quips, and even cutting off takes just to drop jokes that spotlighted him alone. Some called it genius improvisation, but for Martin, it was sabotage. He wasn't just annoyed, he saw it as ego-driven showboating that wrecked the rhythm he worked so hard to craft. And while Martin wasn't the type to start shouting matches, he wasn't going to stay silent either. His weapon of choice? Sarcasm, sharp enough to sting. At one point, he looked at Chevy and cracked, "If ego was money, Chevy could buy Wall Street." The crew laughed nervously, but everyone knew. That joke had a blade behind it. For Steve, Chevy's antics weren't playful. They were power moves. What should have been a fun ensemble comedy kept twisting into a struggle for control, every scene turning into Chevy's battle for center stage. No fists flew, no screaming matches made the tabloids, but the tension was undeniable. The set might not have exploded, but underneath, Martin's patience was stretched thin, and Chevy's ego was the reason why. Martin, Short in the so-called Third Amigo, spent most of filming playing referee, trying to keep peace between Steve Martin's discipline and Chevy Chase's chaos. But even with Short's charm smoothing things over, the damage was done. By the end of Three Amigos, Steve had made up his mind. Never again with Chevy. Hollywood, always hungry to cash in on a hit duo, would have happily thrown Martin and Chase back together on future projects. But Steve wasn't having it. Publicly, he stayed polite, even friendly, but privately, he knew one movie was more than enough. The cult status of Three Amigos today hides just how much tension was bubbling under the surface back then. On screen, it looked like three buddies in perfect rhythm. Off screen, it was really a showcase of total opposites. Steve Martin, the meticulous craftsman who treated comedy like fine art, up against Chevy Chase, the wild card chasing laughs at any cost. To audiences, it was hilarious. To Steve, it was exhausting. The irony cut deep. A film about friendship starring two men who barely tolerated each other once the camera stopped rolling. And just when you think the drama ended there, another clash in Steve's career proved equally messy. This time with none other than Bette Midler. Yes, the queen of camp music and unapologetic showmanship herself. You'd think pairing Martin, the king of razor-sharp absurdity, with Midler's big voice, larger-than-life energy would be comedy magic. Instead, it turned into a night Hollywood insiders still whisper about. The stage was a high-profile charity gala, glittering lights, A-list guests, and plenty of press ready to catch every moment. Steve had agreed to co-host alongside Bette, and like always, he came prepared. His monologue was polished, witty, and sophisticated, walking that fine line between satire and charm. Every beat was planned. Every pause was intentional. Classic Martin. But when you put a perfectionist next to a diva known for stealing every spotlight in sight, sparks are bound to fly, and not the fun kind. Audiences had always known what to expect from Steve Martin: sharp timing, polished wit, and comedy built like clockwork. His stand-up, his TV appearances, even his movies carried that same meticulous structure. For Steve, following the script wasn't about being stiff. It was about rhythm, respect, and keeping the audience hooked from the first line to the last. Bette Midler, though, she played by a whole different rulebook. Known as the Divine Miss M, she thrived on chaos, shock, and spectacle. To her, a gala wasn't about balance. It was about grabbing every spotlight in the room and holding it until nobody else mattered. So when Steve kicked off their carefully prepared charity gala monologue, laying the groundwork for the evening with his sharp humor, Bette did the unthinkable. She veered off script without a single warning. Out of nowhere, she belted into song, her powerhouse voice echoing across the venue, completely drowning out Steve mid-sentence. The crowd gasped, then cheered, dazzled by her theatrical energy. But for Martin, it felt like a bomb had just gone off in the middle of his act. To the audience, it may have looked like playful co-hosts passing the mic, but Steve knew better. His timing, his presence, his entire role had just been steamrolled. It didn't feel like teamwork. It felt like sabotage. The man who could silence an arena with a raised eyebrow was suddenly reduced to a background extra in his own performance. And yet, Steve didn't blow up, didn't argue, didn't try to grab the spotlight back. Always the professional, he smiled through it, played along, and let Midler run wild. But the tension in the room was so thick, people backstage whispered about it for weeks after. By the middle of the night, the co-hosted gala had transformed into a one-woman showcase, Bette basking in her glory, while Steve quietly faded into the sidelines. But then came the breaking point. Without any grand announcement or drama, Steve Martin simply walked out. No tantrum, no scene, just a clean exit that said everything louder than words ever could. For him, it wasn't about ego, it was about respect. A partnership had been promised, but what he got was a takeover. And while Steve might have left the stage that night without firing a shot, his real response came later, with a move that was pure Steve Martin. He sent the charity a generous donation, but attached a handwritten note that read, "Tell Bette it came from her biggest fan." Silence. One sentence. Cold, precise, brilliant. That single line carried the sting of disappointment, the bite of irony, and just enough edge to make sure the message landed exactly where it needed to. The clash never turned into a headline-grabbing feud because Steve wasn't about to drag it into the tabloids. But insiders knew he had been burned, and the whole fiasco revealed a brutal truth about showbiz. Some stars don't share the stage, they devour it. The Hollywood grapevine couldn't stop buzzing after Steve Martin's sly note to Bette Midler. That one-liner donation slip became the story insiders loved to repeat. The perfect mix of wit and sting, a classy dagger only Steve could deliver. It summed up his frustration without a single raised voice, and it instantly became one of those legendary backstage anecdotes whispered at industry parties. What the whole fiasco exposed was more than just one bad night. It was a showcase of two clashing worlds. Steve Martin, the craftsman who worshiped structure, rhythm, and balance, standing against Bette Midler, the diva of unpredictability who thrived on chaos and spectacle. Each was brilliant in their own right, but together, they collided in a way no one could ignore. And Bette wasn't the only one who tested Steve's patience. Enter Robin Williams. On paper, this matchup should have been comedy heaven. Two icons of laughter, two titans of the stage, their powers combined into something unforgettable. But in reality, the sparks that flew didn't create harmony. They set off a clash of styles that left Steve visibly rattled. Steve had built his empire on discipline and precision. His absurd humor was polished, every pause deliberate, every gag sharpened like a blade. Watching him perform was like watching a magician. Elegant, controlled, every move part of a grand design. Robin Williams, though, was the complete opposite. He was pure lightning, a one-man storm. His brain moved faster than most people could keep up, unleashing waves of improvisation, impersonations, and manic energy. He didn't just tell jokes, he became comedy, a whirlwind that left audiences gasping for breath. People adored the madness. But for Steve, it was like standing next to a wildfire with no way to control the flames. The two eventually hit the stage together for a skit designed to show off their contrasting genius. On paper, it looked golden. Steve's calm, calculated wit up against Robin's hurricane of chaos. But once they got going, the reality was brutal. At one critical moment, Robin did what Robin always did. He tossed the script straight out the window. Launching into a wild, unscripted routine, he had the audience howling with laughter, their eyes glued to him. But in doing so, he blew up the carefully constructed rhythm Steve had built. What Williams saw as lightning in a bottle, Steve felt as complete sabotage. To the crowd, it looked like two masters bouncing off each other. But inside, Steve Martin was seething. His precision demolished, his timing wrecked, his performance swallowed by Robin's storm. Later, Steve Martin summed up his clash with Robin Williams in one of his sharpest quips. Performing with Robin is like reading poetry on a roller coaster. That single line said it all: the admiration, the chaos, and the dizzying challenge of keeping up with a man whose mind never stopped spinning. For Robin, the roller coaster was freedom, wild, unstoppable, exhilarating. But for Steve, it was turbulence, thrilling one moment, nerve-wracking the next. And while there was obvious tension in their styles, there was never bitterness. Martin held Williams in the highest regard, recognizing him as a once-in-a-generation genius who could electrify a room in seconds. He marveled at Robin's ability to pull comedy out of thin air, turning even mistakes into punchlines that had audiences doubled over before they even realized what happened. Still, respect didn't equal compatibility. After that skit, both quietly agreed. No more joint projects. They kept their admiration for one another, but they also knew their worlds of comedy could never fully merge. Martin embodied order, rehearsed, balanced, calculated. Robin embodied chaos, comedy as a flood of raw imagination where no script was safe. Both styles dazzled audiences, but trying to share a stage exposed just how overwhelming that contrast really was. Martin's roller coaster line wasn't meant as an insult. It was almost poetic, a nod to Robin's brilliance that only someone who had stood in the storm could truly appreciate. And Robin, for his part, never disrespected Martin. He knew his own style could bulldoze others, and from a distance, he respected Steve's razor-sharp discipline. But if Robin Williams was the unstoppable storm, then Goldie Hawn was the smiling whirlwind. On screen, Steve Martin and Goldie looked like a dream pairing, a comedic duo made in Hollywood heaven. Their 1992 rom-com House Sitter had audiences charmed, a perfect mix of romance, farce, and quick-witted banter. Their chemistry seemed effortless, like two pros riffing off each other in perfect sync. Behind the curtain, though, it wasn't quite so smooth. No screaming matches, no tabloid meltdowns, but a series of small frustrations began to eat away at Steve's patience. Once again, the same issue that had haunted him with other co-stars popped up. His obsession with structure, clashing against someone else's love of spontaneity. Steve, ever the perfectionist, showed up early every day. Script in hand, rehearsed, polished, and laser-focused on timing. For him, comedy wasn't about loose charm. It was about architecture, invisible beats that made every joke land right on cue. Goldie, however, thrived on looseness. Her reputation had always been built on bubbly improvisation and instinctive charisma, the kind of natural charm that made her magnetic to audiences. But on the set of House Sitter, that carefree energy sometimes looked less like magic and more like recklessness in Steve's eyes. She would breeze onto set later than expected, exuding star confidence, ready to feel it out rather than stick to rehearsals. For Goldie, that looseness was part of the fun. For Steve, it was a ticking frustration. Goldie Hawn loved to keep things loose, tossing in improvised lines, little gestures, or playful twists that weren't on the page. For her, that was the fun of acting. It kept the energy fresh, unpredictable, and alive. But for Steve Martin, every unscripted move threatened to throw off the delicate timing he lived by. He admired her charm, no doubt, but the unpredictability gnawed at him night after night. The tension wasn't explosive, but it showed up in subtle cracks. One night during production, Martin pulled out his banjo at a cast gathering, his prized passion outside of comedy. Music, especially bluegrass, wasn't just a hobby for him, it was sacred. He treated it with the same reverence he gave to his most carefully crafted jokes. As he played, Goldie, ever playful, cracked a lighthearted joke at his expense. To her, it was harmless banter in a social setting. But for Steve, that cut deep. On stage, he could laugh at himself, roast himself even. But behind closed doors, His music was off limits. That single joke lingered with him far longer than Goldie likely ever realized. And that was the pattern. No big fights, no shouting matches, just tiny slights that quietly built up into something heavier. By the end of House Sitter, Steve had made his decision. Once was enough. The chemistry that audiences adored didn't match the reality he felt behind the scenes. When Hollywood later floated offers to reunite the two, Martin simply said no. To outsiders, it seemed strange. Why turn down a box office winning duo? But to those close to him, the reason was simple. Steve craved harmony, and with Goldie, he hadn't found it. He never trashed her publicly, never tried to downplay her talent. If he had criticisms, they stayed private, subtle, never loud. But his actions spoke louder than any interview could. Hollywood loves to repeat proven pairings, but Steve refused. And because of that, House Sitter remained their one and only big outing together. But if Goldie Hawn was a quiet frustration, then Bill Murray was a full-blown storm. In comedy, rivalries often simmer below the surface, masked by laughter and smiles. Audiences see the magic, but behind the curtain, egos and tempers clash like thunder. And for Steve Martin, the man who built his career on precision and polish, one of his sharpest clashes came with Bill Murray, a performer who thrived on rebellion, unpredictability, and breaking every rule in sight. The rift sparked in the late 1970s during a live sketch performance, both men at the height of their creative powers, both unwilling to yield an inch. What started as comedy quickly turned into a battle of wills, and it left scars Steve Martin never forgot. By the late 70s, Steve Martin was on fire. Fresh off sold-out stand-up tours and unforgettable Saturday Night Live appearances, he had cemented himself as a comedy powerhouse. Original, razor-sharp, and famously disciplined. Steve was the guy who showed up on time, rehearsed every beat, and treated comedy like a craft that demanded total respect. Bill Murray? He was brilliant too, but in a completely different way. Known for his wild charisma and fearless improvisation, Murray also carried a reputation for volatility, constant lateness, and a love of pushing boundaries just to see who he could rattle. That mix of genius and recklessness made him unpredictable, and it was only a matter of time before it put him at odds with Martin. That breaking point came on a live sketch night that fans still remember for the laughs, but insiders remember for the disaster backstage. Murray strolled in nearly an hour late, leaving Martin and the crew hanging. For Steve, who had been rehearsing cues down to the second, it wasn't just sloppy. It was flat-out disrespect. And if that wasn't enough, once Murray finally hit the stage, he didn't play along. He mocked Martin. With a smirk, Murray tore into Steve's famously clean-cut, polished style, throwing barbs mid-performance that got the audience howling. To the crowd, it looked like sharp improv. But to Steve, standing there as the punchline of Murray's unscripted jabs, it was humiliating. And worse, it blew apart the rhythm he had worked so carefully to create. The audience had no clue about the storm brewing under the spotlight. They saw two comedy titans sharing a stage. Steve saw betrayal. Comedy is rhythm, and rhythm requires trust. That night, Bill shattered both. The aftermath was ice cold. From that moment, Steve Martin and Bill Murray didn't speak for over a decade. Not a call, not a handshake, nothing. And the silence was loud enough for everyone in Hollywood to notice. Even at major industry events, including Cannes, the two kept their distance. No nods, no polite small talk, not even a fake Hollywood smile. They acted like strangers who'd never shared a stage. The fracture ran deeper than bruised egos. It was about two completely opposite philosophies of comedy. Martin believed professionalism was sacred. Show up on time, rehearse, treat every gig, no matter how small, as serious work. Murray embodied chaos, thrive on spontaneity, even if it left others scrambling. To his defenders, that unpredictability was his genius. To Martin, it was recklessness wrapped up as charm. The cruel irony? Both men were giants, shaping comedy in ways that still echo today. Steve brought elegance and absurd sophistication to American humor, while Murray injected it with anarchic fire that broke every rule and kept audiences on edge. Together, they could have been unstoppable. Maybe one of comedy's most legendary pairings. But thanks to that one night, it never happened. Their feud wasn't loud, no public insults, no screaming matches. Instead, it was the quiet kind of break that hurts more, the kind that says, trust me once and lose me forever. And for Steve Martin, perfectionist to the core, Bill Murray had crossed a line that could never be repaired. For Steve Martin, Bill Murray's lateness and mockery weren't just slips in professionalism. They were insults to the very craft that had defined both of their lives. To Martin, comedy wasn't chaos, it was art. And when Murray treated it like a game, it felt like a betrayal. Years later, comedy historians would still whisper about that night, wondering what legendary work the two might have created if the trust hadn't shattered. Both went on to extraordinary careers, but their paths rarely crossed again. And maybe that was always bound to happen. Martin and Murray stood on opposite poles of comedy itself: order versus chaos, discipline versus spontaneity. When they collided, the audience laughed, but behind the curtain, the fallout was permanent, and Murray wasn't the last big name to clash with Martin. Fast forward to the 1990s, at what should have been a glittering night of celebration, a comedy awards show. These events are supposed to be about respect, a chance for comedians to honor each other while giving fans a peek at the brilliance that made them stars. But that night, the stage revealed more than just laughter. It exposed a raw divide in philosophy, this time between Steve Martin and Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey, at the peak of his meteoric rise, was unstoppable. Fresh off Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber, he had become the face of a new era of comedy. His manic energy, rubber-faced expressions, and wild voices turned every stage into his personal playground. Audiences adored the chaos. But to a veteran like Steve Martin, who prized discipline, polish, and the elegance of timing, Carrey's style looked less like art and more like a storm crashing through the room. That divide hit its breaking point during Carrey's acceptance speech. The plan was simple: walk up, give thanks, exit gracefully. Instead, Jim Carrey grabbed the mic and unleashed a spectacle that stretched nearly 14 minutes. He cycled through impressions of Clint Eastwood, Jimmy Stewart, Elvis Presley, and even his fellow comedians sitting right there in the audience. He mugged, he shouted, he contorted his face into impossible shapes. At first, the crowd roared, but as the minutes dragged on, the laughs grew uneasy. What started as fun drifted into indulgence, a performance that felt less like honoring comedy and more like devouring the room itself. And sitting in the front row, Steve Martin wasn't amused. The perfectionist who had built his career on rhythm and restraint grew visibly restless, shifting in his seat while Carrey turned the stage into his own circus. For Steve, it wasn't comedy anymore. It was chaos with no respect for the craft. Steve Martin had always valued brevity at events like award shows. He understood the unspoken rules: keep it tight, keep it sharp, and respect the rhythm that kept the night moving. So as Jim Carrey stretched his thank you into a 14-minute marathon of impressions and antics, Steve's patience snapped. To him, this wasn't brilliance. It was chaos swallowing the stage whole. Then came the moment that left the audience gasping. Steve, sitting front row, leaned back and let out an exaggerated theatrical yawn. The crowd erupted in laughter, thinking it was part of the act. But he wasn't done. Seconds later, Martin strolled onto the stage holding a giant, cartoonish, "Wrap It Up" sign. The room exploded with applause, convinced they were watching two comedy legends pulling off a perfectly timed gag. What they didn't realize, behind Steve's polite smile was real irritation. He had broken one of his own golden rules: never let the audience see your frustration. But Carrey had pushed him too far. Later, Martin admitted candidly that while he respected Jim's raw talent, he found his style absolutely exhausting. To Steve, working with Carrey felt less like collaboration and more like standing in the middle of a comedy hurricane. For Martin, comedy was about balance, knowing when to step forward, when to hold back, when to let silence do the work. Carrey, in Steve's eyes, only knew how to go harder, louder, and wilder. And while audiences adored that energy, for Martin it was chaos masquerading as craft. The fallout didn't end with that awards show. Hollywood insiders later revealed that Steve Martin had been approached for what could have been a blockbuster, a buddy comedy film starring him alongside Jim Carrey. On paper, it was a dream pairing, two icons from different eras colliding for box office fireworks. But when Martin learned Carrey was already attached, he flat out refused. The memory of that exhausting awards show was enough to make him walk away. "We're oil and water," he reportedly confided to friends. Looking back, their clash almost seemed inevitable. Steve Martin had always represented the polished side of comedy, clever wordplay, absurd precision, and routines so carefully constructed they felt like art. Jim Carrey embodied the opposite: unfiltered energy, relentless improvisation, and comedy as spectacle. Both styles worked brilliantly on their own, but together, they created sparks of friction instead of magic. And in that clash, Steve Martin showed once again why he walked away from so many potential collaborations. He wasn't willing to sacrifice structure for chaos, not even for a guaranteed hit. That awards show fiasco was Jim Carrey in a nutshell: fearless, unfiltered, and larger than life. But for Steve Martin, it was the ultimate reminder of why he clung so tightly to discipline. To him, comedy wasn't about drowning a room in noise. It was about rhythm, balance, and making people laugh in a way that lasted without wearing out its welcome. Carrey's chaos might have burned brightest in the moment, but to Steve, it threatened to burn everything around it. Unsurprisingly, the two never built a close relationship. They stayed publicly respectful. No screaming matches, no public shade, but the distance was crystal clear. Hollywood pitched projects that would have paired them up more than once, yet Martin's answer never changed. The memory of Carrey hijacking that stage was etched too deep. He simply wouldn't risk putting himself through months of that same manic storm again. And that's the pattern when you look back at Steve Martin's 6 most infamous clashes. Chevy Chase, who twisted Three Amigos into an ego contest; Bette Midler, who hijacked a charity gala with her diva chaos; Robin Williams, whose genius whirlwind left Steve stranded; Goldie Hawn, whose playful looseness clashed with his precision; Bill Murray, whose lateness and mockery cut him to the core; and Jim Carrey, whose manic energy turned a celebration into frustration. 6 icons, 6 unforgettable clashes, and one clear truth: Steve Martin never bent his discipline, even if it cost him big collaborations. So what do you think? Were these clashes just personality differences, or did Steve Martin demand too much control from his co-stars? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more Hollywood deep dives. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.